seasons for both these teams. So I think we need some primer. Joining us first from the All PHLY Sixers show, my man, Kyle Neubeck. I love Kyle. Kyle!
What up? How we doing today?
Nah, it sucks today, dude. All right? It sucks. I hate the Celtics. I've always hated the Celtics. And once again, they get title number 18. Takes us back in the day to the process. Kyle, right? Jaylen Brown, the same draft as Simmons. Jason Tatum, the same draft as Fultz. Al Horford, the big smell, was horrible here. And you remember, because you covered the game, that first game of the season, when Horford was here, they played the Celtics, and it was supposed to be bully ball. And they dominated the game. They dominated the play. They out-rebounded Boston like 58-33. I'll never forget, because I'm like, oh my God, this is great.
Yeah.
But Brett Brown never coached bully ball.
Well, and my issue, I don't have a lot of animosity for the Tatums and the Browns, right? Like those guys are good players, guys who've pretty consistently won in the playoffs. Al Horford is a really underrated Philly sports villain at this point. Like, he straight up stole money most of that season that he was here. He's supposed to come in and be, veteran leader, Mr. Professional, show the guys how it's done, yada, yada, yada. And then he's making all these passive aggressive quotes in press conferences and, snipping back and forth with Ben and Joel and all this stuff. So, I don't have much feeling for a lot of those guys on that team. Like Drew Holiday, I think, is a great guy. Happy to see him win on some kind of level. Seeing Al Horford finally get his ring, that burned me up a little bit. I won't lie about that.
Dude, I hear you. And I think back to that season. And so I made a bunch of trips with them because I was going to do this process book. And I'll never forget, he was struggling bad. I did a Dallas, Indiana trip, and he was struggling mightily. And I'll never forget walking out of Reunion Arena, and we're underneath, and we're going into the bus, and he had a bad night. It was like a national TV night. It was a Saturday night, big, ABC, and he was horrendous. And he's walking by himself, nowhere near anybody. And that trip, I was really focused on Horford. And he was always by himself. No, I mean, if I told you, there was a big fight. I forget who was fighting that night. And everybody was like watching the fight on the bus and then the plane to Indiana. And he was just off to himself the whole time.
He's a sleeper agent the whole time, Anthony. The part I remember from that season, it was obviously not a very fun season in general, because if you remember too, part of the problem was Joel was looking lustily at Jimmy Butler down in Miami, thinking about, man, what could have been, keep this guy around, maybe we have a chance. And so there's some passive aggressive stuff going on there. But I remember their road trip in LA that year, where I believe Joel missed both those games. And they do the, back-to-back. You play the Lakers, you play the Clippers. And Horford looked like he had just completely mentally checked out. He's getting absolutely beaten like a drum by Anthony Davis. And look, that's one thing. Anthony Davis is really good. And then Zubats is like is taking it to him. And he's like, come on, man. Like, show some pride out there. You're getting paid, however much to come here and be Joel's backup, Joel's replacement when he's hurt, and just whatever. So that burns me up a little bit. But look, now season's over. We move on to the offseason. We move on to thinking about the future and hoping that the Sixers can get things straightened out.
All right, so let me ask you a question here. When you look at this offseason, like, give us the primer of what to expect, right? You got the draft next week. You got free agency. Give us, kind of like the blueprint for everyone of what to expect.
So my expectation on the draft, despite the fact that I want everybody here to watch our draft coverage at PHLY Sixers, is I think they're trading that pick in one form or another. Now, What they do with it, I'm not entirely sure yet. And I do think, and I've been saying this all offseason, I think what they do on draft night will be somewhat of a tell of what they think is happening in free agency, and more specifically, whether they think they can get Paul George. Because I do think, reading all the tea leaves, having talked to people, I do think Paul George seems like the most likely option at this point if they're going to lure a big star. He is the only big name guy that I think is available, like truly available on the open market where there's mutual interest. It seems to me, asking around, I know the Jimmy Butler smoke was there for a little bit, but there's a lot of skepticism that he'll actually move. That they think, a lot of people think at the end of the day, Pat Riley is, holding a tough position right now, trying to get Jimmy to play more games and earn his eventual extension. But I think Paul George is in a position where he kind of feels like he's been disrespected by the Clippers, that they set their top of the market for Kawhi Leonard with the extension that he signed, and they have not made an offer to Paul George that has made him feel sort of like an equal shareholder in their project out in LA. So I think Paul George is seriously considering leaving. I think the Sixers are in a great position because every signal they've sent is, hey, listen, we'll give you the max. There is no doubt about the amount of money they're going to give him. Whether they should pay him a max at 34, 35, 36, 37 years old is a completely fair question, and I understand all the fans who are on the other side of that. But if you get him and all you use to sign him is that cap space, then you have all these picks to say, hey, maybe we can go get an Alex Caruso and add him to the rotation. Maybe we can get some other high-level role players. And I think the philosophy on the Sixers end is that if they get a third star, then you're going to get higher level, minimum contract guys, mid-level type guys, room exception guys, because they're going to be looked at as a team where you can potentially go win a ring.
Yeah, and listen, I get that. I mean, my only thing about Paul George has been, he has just failed in the playoffs. I mean, that's always his look at his track record and coming up small. And, you always looked at Joel and it felt like you needed someone that could lead them to win. But on the floor, it makes sense. Like, he complements both Joel and Tyrese well, from a basketball standpoint. The other issue is, are we think the 3-star model is dead and that you win with, 2 stars and really good depth? So you wonder, we've heard about this before, about getting stars and, filling out the roster. You definitely, Boston does show you this. You got to go 7 deep. You have to. I mean, you look at, as much as we talk about Brown and Tatum, Drew Holiday and Derek White and Porzingis, even with his injuries, had so much to do with it. I mean, they played vital roles in it.
Yeah, but what I would say to that is, they basically have 4 or 5 all-star caliber guys, right? Like, Derek White was in consideration this year. I wouldn't have voted for him to go to the all-star game. But then in Porzingis and Holiday, you have guys who have made all-star teams, guys who are at that level. And Drew Holiday is good enough that he was one of their best players in the series, and frankly, probably won them at least one of these games. Like, he completely swung a game.
There's 2 of them, yeah.
I like what the Mavericks ran into in this series is that, Luka was pretty good, right? Like, he didn't close the series well last time, but he was pretty good. Kyrie had a down series. Boston really contained him. And the Mavericks basically had no answer, right? Like, they couldn't expect, you can't ask Derek Jones Jr. or PJ Washington or Jaden Hardy coming off of the bench, some of these guys, to pick up the slack in that way. And so I do think the league, with the new CBA and all this other stuff, is moving in a way that it looks like it might be a 2-star league now rather than a 3-star league. I don't think the Sixers are operating that way. And to your point about, I get it with Paul George and the past playoff failures and whatnot, But really, like, this immediate future for the franchise all hinges on, can Joel stay healthy and can he be better than he has been in the playoffs? And frankly, can Tyrese Maxey also continue to grow and maybe become the closer for this team? Because if Joel can't be the number one guy for a title team, it really does not matter who this third guy is. You're not getting, LeBron James in his prime to come here, right? Like, even the pie in the sky pipe dream scenario is, hey, maybe you're able to trade everything for Donovan Mitchell and he becomes that like lead option late in games. So I think if you get that, instead of having Tobias Harris sitting on a mountain of money and giving you nothing in the playoffs, if you have Paul George, who is not good enough to be that one, even maybe number two guy, but he's your third guy and he's the best fitting player,
Yeah.
and he makes life easier
And that's
for
why
Joel
it makes
and Tyrese.
sense. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that has to be the hope, because, and I get it. People are frustrated with Joel, especially you see Boston is winning. And not only did they win this year, they've been consistently getting deeper into the playoffs. They'd already lost the finals, been to like 5 or 6 conference finals in the last however many years. So they've been way better, and Philadelphia wants more. I get that. It really all comes down to Joel Embiid, because if he's not good enough, all of this other stuff is just window dressing.
What do you say to our people who are like our coworker, Vince, who might say it's time? And I had a buddy of mine, Dom, who said the same thing. Like, maybe it is time to try to get the biggest package for Joel. Now, I wouldn't do that. To me, you've come this far. You could put a Paul George. You could, between George and Maxey, and try to fill out a roster. You got to take your shot. But what do you say to the other side that says, hey, you know what? Maybe it is time to kind of circle back and rebuild it?
I just look at it and say, I don't see the sense of it unless you are getting an offer that I have never heard is really out there, right? Like, the reason that teams that trade for stars more often win is because in the NBA, they're just like, there is no real replacement value for a top 5, top 10 player. Like, the Sixers would pretty instantly go from a team that almost automatically wins 50 games if Joel's healthy and has a puncher's chance in the playoffs, to a team that is, as I'd say, pretty questionable direction. How do you even build the roster out around Tyrese Maxey? What is the plan? Because you would be getting a lot of picks more than likely. You're not getting, oh, this guy's coming in and he's going to be the star alongside Tyrese Maxey. You'll get young guys and you'll get picks.
Yeah, you got to build it again. It's a whole rebuild. Yeah. I don't have the stomach for it. I mean, quite frankly, and I'm this close. I got to take one more shot at it, is how I would look at it.
Yeah, like, look, I think the Tobias Harris point is one that I've been hammering. It's like, let's see what this team looks like with a third and fourth player, however you want to frame it, that isn't actively dragging them down and wasting, $40 million of cap space. Because that's the thing. Like, it's, once they sign the contract, it is what it is. Like, you can only judge him for what he offers on the floor. This guy's taking 2 shots in an elimination game and not offering you much on the defensive end either. And they've been so boxed in by that contract. This is the biggest offseason by far of Daryl Morey's tenure. This is his chance to give Joel Embiid a proper supporting cast, add some athleticism, add some real wings to this team. That's the other thing. Like, on top of, like, set aside Paul George. Let's say they don't get him. They need to get athletes on this team so they can defend, so they can get out and run. And frankly, so that when Joel Embiid comes off the floor, they don't completely fall apart. Because all these years into his career, that's still the number one problem. That he wore down in that series, had some bad fourth quarters, but it was much, much, much worse when they took him off. And it creates this toxic loop where he's got to play too many minutes because they can't live without him. But then he plays too many minutes and he's too fatigued to be the best player on the floor at the end of games. So they got to get better high-end depth, and they got to fill out their rotation, because as much as he needs to step up, he needs better help.
There's a name. I like DeAndre Hunter from Atlanta. Give me some any names you hear, any guys you covet that are gettable?
So Caruso, I think, is still one of those guys that I think when push comes to shove, the Bulls set a really high line on him at the deadline. Teams were offering multiple picks and they were turning that down. I think they might have a come to Jesus moment this offseason and say, it's time. Like, let's get value for him. Doesn't have a lot of time left on his contract. And I think he's the type of guy, he will help Tyrese Maxey defensively. He's not a great shooter, but he's one of those like little things, connected passers type guys, can drive a little bit. I'm not worried about him in a playoff setting. I would put it that way. I do like Hunter. We've talked about him. To me, it's really interesting. It really depends on what happens with free agency with Paul George or one of these other big names. Because if they sign Paul George, essentially you're limited to, I think you probably have like a $10 million slot and then like a $6 million slot. So I think Batum is really likely to come back. I know they really like him, and I know that despite some retirement rumors, I think he is interested in coming back. So Ricky Council, I think, is going to play a role. He's on a cheap deal the next few years. But other than that, you're going to have to do some more reclamation projects, I think. Like John Collins was a guy I mentioned on one of our shows this summer that if you strike out, maybe you take a flyer on him and say, he's a guy that has been a little bit of a malcontent, but he can rebound. He's a guy who offers some secondary rim protection. He's a good lob guy. I'm not sure they have kept their cards pretty close to the vest beyond the big names, though. So we're going to see. It's going to be really interesting.
All right, 2 quick things, and we'll get out of here. Nothing marketing is it probably no shot?
Yeah, I just don't think they're moving him. I think my word that I've gotten is the owner loves him.
I love him I love him on this team. Sucks. Yeah.
I think Jazz ownership loves him, which, white guy in Utah who's really good. Not surprising that they're holding on to him pretty tightly. Yeah. But yeah, he would be awesome. So unfortunately, I don't think he's gettable.
And what's the time frame? Like, so tell people the timeline leading up to the draft and how things would go.
Yeah. So now that the finals are over, the guys who are extension eligible actually can start signing deals now. So I would suspect, the draft is next Wednesday, Thursday. Leading into that, we will probably get some form of update on Paul George. And that's why I think if there's going to be a big trade, it will happen draft night. And that's when we'll know, hey, they have a real shot for Paul George, or they think he's going back to LA. So I think right now, from what I can tell, looking at the landscape, a lot of eggs in the Paul George basket. But over the next week, there's plenty that can change. And so then you have, right after the draft ends, there's like that legal tampering period for a day or two. And July happens and we're off to the races. So July 1st and onward, it's going to be fast and furious.
Can't wait. Hey, Kyle, great stuff, my brother. You know that. Love you, buddy.
Thanks for having me on. See you soon.
Kyle Neubeck, all PHLY Sixers show.
We all silly like the mayor.